One might be inclined to think the government's recent budget might have been copied from a prior government, like the NDP or the Liberal even, from the past. Of course it's not, because unlike those budgets, this PC government is spending far more than other governments in the entire history of our province. That's excluding spending relief related to COVID-19 and has absolutely no path to balance. Let the record show that some of the headlines that this government's budget has received, and I might add from some sources that are quite friendly to the government and happy to routinely give apology coverage. The Canadian Press, Ontario's long path to balance is a problem. Experts. Matt Gurney, Doug Ford is no longer a budget hawk. So what is he now? National Post, editorial board. Ontario budget spends too liberally and has no clear path to balance. Randall Denley, writing in the National Post. Upcoming Ontario budget is bound to agitate both PC supporters and the public sector. Quite the accomplishment there, Mr. Speaker, I must say. Randall Denley in the National Post again. Ontario 2021 budget filled with red ink, tired ideas, and no plan to restore reality. Yikes. CBC's Mike Crawley, post-pandemic red ink is the most startling thing about Doug Ford government's new budget. In The Sun, Ontario budget 2021, more per child cash, but decade of red ink looms. Fraser Institute writes, Ontario's latest budget will keep debt interest costs rising. A couple more, Mr. Speaker. Laurie Goldstein in The Sun, Ford government on the verge of a debt crisis, says report. Also Goldstein in The Sun, Ford's budget channels Wynne, McGuinty and Trudeau. Oof. And finally, again by the Fraser Institute, Ford fiscal strategy resembles McGuinty-Wynne plans with predictable results. Quite the accomplishment, Mr. Speaker, for a premier who spent years vilifying all three and claiming that he was different, and saying in the last election campaign that his party was the only fiscally responsible option. What a joke. It's amazing, the consistency of this government. I can practically talk about the same points on this budget as I did last November. So now let's look at the details and revisit to a certain degree last November. This year's deficit is projected to be north of $33 billion. Last budget was north of $30 billion. This spending is not temporary and not just due to COVID measures. The PC government is planning on continuing their record spending, and they again provide no plan to get back to a balanced budget, stating simply that it will take a decade, 10 years. I remind the House, a track to balance was a specific promise made by this government in its campaign in 2018, and they have broken that promise. COVID-19 or not. I remind you again, and as I said in November, that prior to COVID, this PC government was spending more on an annual basis than the prior government, and publicly disclosed they were not planning on getting back to balance in their 4-year mandate. Another promise broken. This government needs a plan to get businesses back up and running as soon as possible. They've been forced to close their doors for 3 times over the last year. They need a plan to reduce these historically high spending levels. They need to do so within its 4-year mandate, not 10 years from now. They need to provide a plan that would boost Ontario's economic growth post-coronavirus. They can't go back to historically low levels of economic growth and exit the recession in this manner. This Premier claims on social media that after COVID, the government is going to unleash unprecedented power and growth, unprecedented growth. They've already shown unprecedented power with Bill 195, but I digress. Unprecedented growth, and yet the budget shows a measly 2% growth, even after COVID. That's not a plan for a stronger economy or strong economic growth. That is a plan to reach the status quo from the government that said it would ensure Ontario was open for business, whatever that means. Because you know what? Ontario is in fact not open for business. We are closed for business. We have no plan to reopen and no plan to grow the economy after COVID. And Mr. Speaker, that is a shame. Mr. Speaker, these levels of spending, where we are projected to be spending on an annual basis over $10 billion just to manage our debt, this will impact our province's ability to continue providing services in education and in health care. And as our deficit stays historically high, and as our debt load grows, there will come a time when we can't even afford to maintain what we currently have for health care, what we currently have for education, never mind even making them any better. We're going to see increased class sizes. Healthcare times will not decrease. In fact, they'll increase. People will have to turn to other options simply because this province, Ontario, will simply not have any money left to maintain the public services that the taxpayers pay so much for. We will not be able to improve them. In addition, Mr. Speaker, I'd like to point out that now, 3 years into this government's mandate, after promising to put money back in people's pockets, this budget, much like the last budget, provides no personal tax relief. None. In fact, this government has done a tax increase in its 3 years that is now permanent as a result of its terrible performance at the Ontario courts and the Supreme Court of Canada, where it threw the carbon tax court challenge against the Justin Trudeau Liberal government by conceding 2 out of the 3 legal arguments in that case and all the facts. And this government knew it was losing. Of course they did. They didn't even try to win. That is why they introduced an industrial carbon tax and got it blessed and approved by the federal Liberal government, which provides this provincial government with increased revenues. So, in essence, a tax increase. So for industry, a carbon tax. For small business and individuals, no broad-based tax relief after 3 years of a supposed Conservative government. Again, from the government that claimed it would put money back in the pockets of Ontarians. Mr. Speaker, let's talk a bit about electricity. This government had complete power and authority to cancel the wind turbine project in North Stormont. They didn't have to pay any fees, and they used incorrect examples to justify continuing this project. As has been written by Professor Bruce Pardy of Queen's University, it requires a bill, not a cabinet order or a ministerial order that results in lawsuits, but a bill in this legislature, in this House, to cancel and decommission wind turbine projects like the one in North Stormont and any others that we don't need. A bill as in legislation that decommissions and sets the compensation, if any. That is because this legislature has parliamentary supremacy, and past governments cannot bound future governments. When it comes to taking such actions, I'm sure that the government and its fancy apologists in the media will scoff and say it's unrealistic. The Minister of Health will say, as she has in the past, it will drive investment away and turn Ontario into a banana republic. Yet this government has no problem using that same parliamentary authority to impose more than a year of emergency measures that led to 25,000 businesses shuttering their doors and closing down their businesses, putting people out of work, causing harm to people's mental health, that they justify in the name of pretending to stop the spread of COVID, which they have failed to do, as we see by our new numbers every day growing. Yet, to fight and reverse energy poverty and to grow our economy by reducing electricity rates by decommissioning expensive wind turbine projects that produce surplus energy that we are dumping into other jurisdictions for pennies on the dollar. This government pretends they cannot figure out what to do, and they pretend that they don't have the power. It's an absolute shame, Mr. Speaker. So in conclusion, Mr. Speaker, as I've said, the people of Ontario wanted a government, voted for a government, gave this government a mandate to implement fiscally responsible budgets. We've had 3, none of which have been fiscally responsible. They wanted a government to get electricity rates down, to provide personal tax relief, to get Ontario's fiscal house in order, and most importantly, to grow our economy. Instead, after 3 long years, they got a government who is spending heavier than the Liberals and any other government in the history of this great province. No wonder people don't trust this government. No wonder people don't trust governments. They don't trust decision makers, and they question what is going on. And that, Mr. Speaker, is a most terrible shame. Thank you.